Hello guys, today we are going to continue circle of Willis. So in previous lecture we learned about the structure and the anatomy of the circle of Willis, but now we're going to study the functions, that is the areas that this particular circle of Willis or the arteries supply. So first of all, the circle of Willis is divided into two parts. First anterior and second one is posterior. The anterior part supplies the frontal and the parietal lobe of our brain, and the posterior part supplies the occipital and the parts of temporal, plus it also supplies the brain stem. So by this what we mean that if there is a stroke, in particular the anterior circulation of our brain, it will hamper the supply of frontal and parietal lobes and thus the functioning of frontal and parietal lobe. Our frontal lobe has Broca's area. If some injury or clot happens in the anterior circulation, it will hamper our Broca's area and ability to speak. Then second is posterior. So if stroke happens in this posterior aspect of our brain, it will hamper the function of occipital part and the temporal lobe of our brain, and the functions performed by the brain stem. So these are the functions of our lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for problem solving, judgment, personality, and arm motor planning. The second parietal is responsible for sense of touch, visual perception, reading, writing, or language. And the third one is occipital. It is responsible for mainly two, sight and visual perception. And the fourth is temporal lobe. So this temporal lobe is responsible for our memory functioning, our hearing functioning, what we hear, the feelings, how we feel about something, learning process, and musical awareness. So all these lobes are actually interconnected and linked. If one lobe is responsible for memory, it doesn't mean that the second or the other lobe will not be responsible for memory. They work collectively in brain. So by this we can interpret that if there is problem in the anterior aspect, then particularly our two lobes will be mainly affected, the frontal and the parietal. So the functioning of these two lobes will be affected. And if there is problem in posterior aspect of the blood circulation, then which two lobes will be affected? That are occipital and temporal. So by this, the functioning of occipital, that is visual perception and all, and temporal functionings are these. All these will be affected if the posterior aspect is affected. Now what are actually the anterior and posterior aspects? Which arteries are included in them? Now we'll study about that. So the anterior and the posterior part. So the anterior part mainly consists of these three arteries. First important one is ACA, which is actually called anterior cerebral artery. Then the second one is MCA, which is the middle cerebral artery. Okay, so this is the anterior and posterior aspect. The anterior aspect includes the ACA, which is actually the anterior cerebral artery, which we have studied in that circle of Willis. And this MCA is the middle cerebral artery, and the third one is the anterior communicating artery. So these three arteries are associated with the anterior aspect, and as we have studied that the anterior aspect mainly involves the frontal and the parietal area. So the main cause will be related to the functioning of these lobes, and additional some factors that will be some signs and symptoms that will be seen are the hemiplegia of contralateral side, which means that if your right hemisphere of the brain is affected, then the left side of your body will get paralyzed. So these are some signs and symptoms that will be seen if the anterior aspect is damaged or it has some blockage. Now comes the posterior aspect. Now these are the arteries of the posterior aspect. So first one is basilar, second is vertebral, third is PCA, which is the posterior cerebral artery, and the fourth one is posterior communicating artery. Now this part supplies mainly the leftover lobes, which we have seen that were first temporal and other one was occipital. So these two lobes, plus it also supplies the brainstem and the cerebellum. So functioning of brainstem includes the autonomic functioning, the sensory functioning, and the function of cerebellum includes balance, locomotion. So if this posterior aspect is particularly damaged, what will happen? The function of brainstem, that is sensory functioning, will be lost, autonomic functions will not be done, and the temporal lobes function, the occipital lobes function, the function of cerebellum, that is balance and coordination, will be lost. So this is particularly what will happen when the posterior aspect is affected. So we have studied about the anterior aspect as well as the posterior aspect.